Daniel Akers to be all Texas specific about it. And I want to talk to you about my favorite liberating structure, the discovery action dialogue, or DAD, because it's the bee's knees. Dads are bomb. Um, but why? When do you need to use the discovery action dialogue? Why should you care? Well, maybe you found yourself in a situation similar to this. You are a person in a group of people, and that group of people all cares about something. Maybe it's the outcomes of your, a very narrow and specific portion of your upper watershed. Maybe it's your kid's, soccer team. Perhaps it is your product at work. And around that thing that you care a whole lot about together, um, there are so many wishes. There's so many wishes, so many dreams, so many visions, so many possibilities of what you could pursue. And yet, there is never enough resources, never enough time, never enough labor, never enough to get anywhere near all of those beautiful visions done. If you find yourself in such a situation where you've got more ambitions than you've got resources, you might need yourself some better than normal practice to escape what we like to call the scarcity trap of not having enough and having great, good ideas and initiatives that you'd like to invest in, but you don't have the resources in order to do so. So you might need to innovate your way outside of this here scarcity trap, and to do so, I'll invite you to take a look at Discovery Action Dialogue. So, what's the TLDR? The too long did not read. What's the brief on the structure? Well, Discovery Action Dialogue is going to help us to reveal good practice. And good practice is great because there's all types of great practice out there. And some practice is better than normal practice. And that's what we're looking for. We're going to call that better than normal practice positive deviance. And we sure as shit want to spread it. So, of course, we're going to find those things and share knowledge about them. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to gather together in a group of 6 or 7 nerds. And we're going to ask one of those nerds to take on the role of host to keep time and make sure that everybody answers each of the questions, or has an opportunity to at least. And somebody's going to ask a scribe. The scribe is going to go ahead and take notes and keep the minutes of the meeting, however, in God's name, you feel like, or the scribe feels like. They can do it in a shared doc, they can do it on a whiteboard, they can do it on a flip over chart, they can do it on a notebook. But we are going to need an artifact of this conversation. So the scribe is in charge of that. And for every person that you put in the container of the Discovery Action Dialogue, you want to calculate yourself about 1 minute per person for each of what are going to be 7 questions that consist of the classic Discovery Action Dialogue. So in this instance, we've got ourselves 6 nerds in the dialogue. 6 times 7 is 46. That feels sketchy. I must have added some buffer minutes for explaining shit and stuff, reasons. Never you mind. Uh, Never you mind the precise mathematics of minutes remaining. At any rate, how's the Discovery Action Dialogue go? So we've got ourselves we're sitting in a circle, more than likely. We've got ourselves a host. We've got ourselves a scribe. We're just going to basically run through a conversation, relatively freeform, around these 7 questions. And we're going to starting place is always this problem, solving the problem. Many problems or predicaments. They don't have solutions, but we do things to alleviate them, right? We do have adaptive behavior that helps us get through situations and move on to the future. So, how do we know that our problem is present? Problem orientation is pretty good, actually. I know appreciative appreciative inquirers, yes, appreciative inquirers may not like problem orientation, but I love problem orientation because problems have solutions, unless they're predicaments, in which case they don't, but never mind. So how do we know when the problem is present? What do you see, hear, or notice? We want to get ourselves some basic sense making about that lets us know that we are in our condition or our problem or our challenge zone. What's it like for us? Just to make sure that we've got a good inventory of this is actually what's going on. This is the stuff that we need to address. And then we want to ask folks, all right, nerds, how do you contribute to effectively solving that problem? What do you do that normally works well enough to get us over the hump and cross the finish line? Because everybody does something, right? Everybody's got some solution set. Some solution, not all solution sets are created equal, but everybody's got something, and we can all learn from one another, right? And then, but we'll notice that despite our normal solution set, stuff does happen that really, you know, prevents us from working that solution or gets in the way or just provides too much resistance or whatever. So what is the stuff that gets in the way that really makes this problem quite wicked? What makes it a much more challenging predicament? And who do you know that is able to solve for this stuff well? Who do we know that's able to address the problem and never seems to get stopped by the stuff that stops us? Um, who are those people? Like, who are the inspirational, positive deviants in our lives that we've heard of, that we're familiar with? Of course, these can be people we know. Those are the best, tangible, concrete. What do they do? But these could also be people that we know of, that we know via that exist in the cultural mythos, and think about actual cultural mythical characters. Absolutely, grab those archetypes. There's a lot of embedded information and wisdom in the metaphors of those stories. Um, so yeah, let's find those sources of inspiration and let's ask ourselves, what do they do? And on the basis of that inspiration, do we have any new ideas about how we might approach our situation? And, the classical sense, I emphasized in the beginning the importance of having a shared context, because I think that's what makes this structure really sing. Um, in that shared context, then, with whatever our 15% solution is, whatever the ideas we cook up with these ingredients we've been inspired to play around with, um, chances are high that there will be stuff that needs to be done to make it happen. And we're definitely going to want to know who's most keen on making that stuff happen. And then, of course, who else needs to be involved with that stuff, right? Who's in the stakeholder context that we're going to let them know, hey, we're going to be, messing around in this kitchen to try and address this stuff. So hold on to your butts and check out what we got to thinking. What do you think about that stuff? You ever thought about it? Blah, blah, blah. So that's discovery, action, dialogue. Group of people, host, scribe, and 7 questions. If you don't have a shared context, then 5 questions are good enough, right? If you're bringing together some cross-contextual nerds and you just want to vibe and brainstorm about this stuff. But if you've got a shared context, then you definitely need those two to really get into tangible solution space. So we can think about this structure from these 3 different design point perspectives, right? You've got your context, that you've done your situational assessment, your place, your purpose, your people, your parameters. So we can think about discovery, action, dialogue in particular through all 3 forms of structures. So we can think about discovery, action, dialogue through the lens of interaction patterns, right? This mechanic of a group of people. We assign a host/timekeeper that helps everybody answer the questions. We have a scribe that takes notes and creates artifacts. Yay! So and we give 1 minute per person to answer this list of questions. We can think about regurgitating that architecture or that interaction pattern for effectively any set of structures or any particular line of inquiry. which sort of brings us to our next one, which is the line of inquiry. I'm going to park actually line of inquiry and talk a little bit more about other lines of inquiry we might put in the place of this line. This one is, of course, super valuable, right? It helps us to reveal this positive deviance. But there's also sorts of great lines of inquiry that we can make use of, that we can put in this structure. How about the most simple, basic one, which is what, so what, now what? What's going on that matters? Why does that stuff matter? What makes it significant? And, what do we intend to do about it, right? What, so what, now what can go into this same basic, can go in place of these questions into this same basic time boxing, structural, architectural, interaction-y pattern-y stuff, right? Strategic not working, I've talked about in the past, of using the 6 questions of strategic not working in this same sort of interaction repattering, time boxy type of way. There's all types of really interesting series of questions, lines of inquiry that helps us to get different types of stuff done, to direct the attention, right? The whole point behind the line of inquiry, the specific series of questions, is that they help guide the conversation towards a productive outcome. So we just want to be cognizant of what's the right question for right now, and we can use whatever we deem as the right question in this box of the space to redesign or exact the discovery action dialogue interaction pattern for any line of inquiry. This in particular, this line of inquiry is great because we're getting all of our goods. We are addressing, the reality that, hey, there's something going on. We're getting information on the table. We are talking about the fact that there are always solutions to problems, right? We are leaning into this principle of respecting people and their local solutions, right? We're not trying to tell anybody their solution sucks, but we are trying to acknowledge the fact that there's not all solutions are created equal, and sometimes there is a second order consequence or something interacting in the environment that's even more important than the problem at hand in addressing the problem at hand, right? So this sort of helps us to think about the indirectness, the indirect stuff. So if we know what the problem is, what are the problems that prevent the normal solutions to the problem is a very rich subset of like niching down our attention into what we should do stuff about. And then, of course, like we got the back half, which is this secondary line. First, you're exploring your return on inspiration, right? Who inspires us, and how can we emulate? How do we become little versions of our big heroes? Good enough for now, safe enough to move on. And when we talk about good enough for now, safe enough to move on, I think these 2 questions are perhaps just like the bee's knees. How great are the questions of like what needs to be done to make it happen? What are the concrete steps? What's our action plan? And who volunteers to do that stuff? It's all great to build castles in the sky and go, somebody should, but hey, who's going to step up and, become our heroine in this, darkest night? And who else needs to be involved, right? Thinking about your stakeholder context, thinking about this is sort of the traditional interface of like marketing, almost like the interface between your group and the outside environment. So how are you going to bring your change into being by interacting with those that you want, that are interested, that are going to be influenced and affected by whatever change you're doing, right? How do we have good sense making? So this particular line of inquiry, that's a chef kiss, solid gold soul. That's great. I love it. Now, we can also talk about discovery action dialogue from the perspective of, this documentation, right? The documentation, the durable artifacts, the notes that we create out of this type of session as being, once more, very important for that. How do we involve the wider stakeholder context to capture the contents of conversations that nerds are able to have together and to share what we discover and we learn in that sort of closed door, safe context is fucking essential. So, you know, there's a lot to be said about my aesthetic is obviously keep it very simple. Like what gets you 90% of the value with 1% of the input and crush it. Just get it done. Um, so using things that are docs, see that has a loose format, has a lot of advantage. But when we talk about coordination across contexts, then we want to think much more about enabling structures. How do we put the content of this information into a structure that helps other people interface with it, perhaps in ways that it can even become automated, right? So shout out to all my large language model nerds in the house. I'm looking forward to how you can help. Now, all right, end of video. That's discovery action dialogue. That's why you want to use it, because we've got more shit that we want to do about the thing that we care about, and it's really hard to do that together, right? It's really hard to make lists of priorities and prioritize them and blah 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 blah, and the collective governance thing, especially like the decision making about what you're going to do. So, discovery action dialogue is a really great way that helps distribute that decision making in a very, very grassroots and almost spontaneous way, right? You can imagine a whole bunch of the groups doing this discovery action dialogue, and then just popping off on, hey, all right, so what were the ideas and initiatives that you nerds were inspired to, and then you just start coordinating across those different groups and those different ideas. Be like, oh, well, you nerds need to talk because this sounds like you're vibing in the same vibe. Anyway, discovery action dialogue, good stuff. Now, I want to talk, and if you're still here, then you're down for listening. So I want to talk a little bit about what the discovery action dialogue as a pattern helps us to learn, right? So remember, our sort of set and setting is scarcity trap. We're stuck with all this energy, all this excitement, all this ambition, all this yearning for new ways of living and being, and just possibilities that we are fantasizing about, and hope and daydreaming to bring into existence, and sometimes sweating our balls off to do that, or your yoni, whatever. You know what I mean. So, man, I lost my train of thought on that. Fucking sweat my balls off joke. Jesus, overthinking the gender inclusivity of my statement has derailed my train of thought. So what can we learn? What can we learn based on discovery action dialogues, based on this pattern of thinking? Our set and setting is scarcity trap. We are stuck and mired with more ambition than we have resources to realize them. So this is actually a really, really fraught place. We have to make hard choices. Quite truthfully, you might find yourself in a crisis management or triage setting in which you're literally deciding, all right, who can I save? In scarcity trap, God willing, you don't. I prefer. I hope we have more time, but look, existential risk is out there, right? So, how do we make friends with the future? I think we make friends with the future by learning to be more resourceful. And I think that's what discovery action dialogue actually helps us to learn. So, without nerding out too much, or maybe just enough, I want to talk to you about the 8 forms of capital, dreamt up by Gregory Landau and some other nerds. Shout out to Gregory. He's featured on the Wise Crowds, Hup the Pup, once or twice. Anyway, 8 forms of capital. So very often when we think about resources, we're sort of stuck in this very, very narrow lens of, like, when I say resources, often we're thinking financial resources. We're thinking about financial capital, and we're thinking about money, the money I don't have specifically, and what I would do with that money, right? And maybe if you're super savvy, and you think about money, you think about this shit. But more often than not, when we're trying to get shit done, we're very much stuck in the blindness of what are the financial resources we don't have. But when we start to think, ask the questions in the discovery action dialogue, what we find is that there are people that are effective. Some of them may have access to this resource, but what you may find is that they're leveraging other totally different forms of capital um, to be effective in their context than um, than you may initially imagine, right? It's very easy to be dismissive of those that have financial capital, right? Those that are throwing money because a there's not a lot that I can do to emulate their success, right? Point blank period. Um, Maybe if I think further back in their developmental process, what did they do when they were at the stage of the game that I am at? Perhaps there's much to learn in that instance. But that's much more like this is more reflective. That requires considerable nuance. Whereas those people that are, especially the ones that I'm connected to, that are making it happen by coordinating material, or especially those that are effective in social capital. But of course, I'm sure you know a big brain nerd who's got lots and lots of this intellectual capital, or adventure seeking old uncle who has been around the world and back again and has all the embodied experience, many ayahuasca trips and so forth, and plant medicine, and of course, the sage, the mage, those who have done great introspection and worked. And of course, the background context or cultural capital, right? The ability to influence song, story, ritual, to be an active guide or steward of community. Ooh, hallelujah. So it's really cool if you can go through your laundry list. And I don't actually, I mean, I do suggest actually that you do check this out. Go through your laundry list of your different actions and going, hey, what types of forms of capital are these nerds leveraging? Now that we have this list and this documentation, we can see that, oh, actually, what we're finding is that people are very effective at solving this problem if they're working in the social layer, right? They're working in the connections, they're working in relationships. Um, they've got lots of influence to be peddled here. Um, of course, right? You can look at the social capital and you can go, ooh, I don't have that. But I think it's much more not just inspiring, but just fucking accessible, right? Social capital is something I can grind towards, that I might be able to grind towards with much fewer barriers to entry than I can grind towards financial capital, right? So just thinking in these different forms of resources helps us to be more resourceful, right? Helps us to be more creative. And I think there's also an interesting implication that when we start talking about these different ways of being and influencing the world, these different forms of capital. Number one, we start to value them, right? We can literally see them now that we have the taxonomy, right? Now that we have the list, they suddenly snap into becoming visible, which means that we can notice, we can pay attention, we can now learn across these different dimensions of reality, which is really interesting. And I think helps us to recognize that we are not in as much as of a scarcity trap, even if we are in a particular scarcity trap, right? Financial resources are by definition still scarce, but guess what? Intellectual capital, you know, social capital, even material capital is much, much, much more abundant than you might think, right? Um, so I really love this question around like what can we do, with just what we got in the kitchen, the 15% solution, right? How can we reorganize and link and leverage the resources that we do have? Um, I don't talk very often, but I am very enthusiastic about a community of practice and a book called Strategic Doing. That it's just great. It's just great in terms of doing this type of work that we're talking about in the Discovery Action Dialogue. One other aspect that I think this is, of course, getting way, 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 way far away from our initial provocation, which is to Discovery Action Dialogue. But what it does help us to do is when we start thinking about these different forms of capital, these different forms of wealth, right? Again, we're validating them. We're saying that they matter just as much, if not more, than these other forms of capital, these other forms of wealth. There's a whole bunch to be said about this particular drawing that I'm definitely not interested in doing right now, but you can totally look this thing up. Go track down Art Brock and the Metacurrency Project, and you can find this thing and him nerding out about it. I think at Occupy Wall Street or some shit. Um, but what thinking through these different forms of capital and a different lenses on wealth, seeing currency as not just a thing, but seeing the current or the flow of these resources, right? And seeing the current or flow of the resources, like the eco cycle tells us, helps us ultimately to do what Carol Sanford describes as indirect work. Um, I love this book. It's amazing. I think it like clearly and succinctly describes um, many of the facets that are challenging for people to grok around liberating structures is that they are tools for indirect work. And what do I mean by indirect work? I mean that we see at the object level, right? You see a thing. There's a thing. Are out there, right? You see this thing and you go, oh, check it out, right? And maybe if you're super, super mindful, you look at it for the first time, and you notice where it begins and ends, and you look at it and just notice, right? But you're still looking at the object. If you want to influence that object, of course, you can push on it, right? Yeah, I recommend pulling on it, particularly like tugging on it. It's probably better than pushing, but whatever. Um, that's always sort of limited in effectiveness, right? It just, I mean, sure, you can move a cup from the table to the dishwasher, totally. Um, but when we're working on objects, when we're working on outcomes, especially when we're talking about people, right? Working on a person, working on the outcome that is a person, we recognize that that is a big, complex ball of yarn. And working on that big, complex ball of yarn, it gives us more affordance. It gives us more purchase on the object, actually, to work lower into the causal stack of where it comes from, right? If I recognize that every object, every outcome is the result of some process, it has its own story, it has its own history, it has its own causality that is absolute for it. Um, when we can see that whole journey it takes, we get all of these interesting intersections and points that we can nudge it one direction or another, right? And that can help you separate the wheat from the chaff and go, hey, with those limited time and resources I've got, where am I going to put my attention? Am I put my attention into a marketing campaign to tell people the thing I want them to know, or am I going to, figure out a way for them to be inspired by it, and want to and yearn to know more about it, right? That's even deeper, but like I can deliver the knowledge, or I can inspire the learning. I can figure out along the way how the knowledge accumulates, and I can add knowledge way back here so that it's just there when I need it, rather than trying to push it into the place. 1 minute, mom, my love. Um, so now I have to end this thing quite abruptly. So what do I want to say is, work indirectly. Instead of working from objects and outcomes, find out the process that results in those objects and outcomes, and figure out how to influence that. That will give you more purchase on the objects and outcomes, is what I'm saying. If you want to get even more purchase than the process, then think about the relationships. Think about the relationships of the things in the process, and how you can influence and nurture those relationships towards the things in the process. And you will find your objects and outcomes improve dramatically. Or to put it a better way, you will have more levers, more affordances to influence objects and outcomes. And you know what? If you can really nurture relationships, then I think it's almost inevitable that you get to essence, that you come to the developmental nature of life, the universe, and everything. and recognize that what we're trying to do is we're trying to love things into the fullness of their being. We're trying to help them to develop and grow and make manifest whatever their essence is in a more clear and uh, like authentic, I hate that word, but a pure and direct way. We want the essence of things to fucking shine like a beacon, so that instead of trying to push things where they need to go, we light up that fucking beacon in the world, and people just tug it where it needs to be because they know they can. It's now salient for them, and they need it. So when we can enable things, when we can enable to nurture the essence of something, we are helping all of its relationships by helping it to be in more right relationship with the world. Um, Healthy relationships, I think, as we sort of recognize in the world of relational coordination, or trying to get shit done, right? Kent Beck said it beautifully. He said that that creating software was an exercise in human relationships, right? And that excellent software and excellent system design has more to do with the relationships and the people that created the software than it does with the technical details of the software itself, call systems, blah blah blah, latency, etc. Nerd. Nerds love niches. Um, yes, they do. Say it with me now. Nerds love niches. That's a different set. I'll get out of it for now. Um, so yeah. So if the relationships between the people are good, then you can get through all the technical stuff, all the challenges, all the adversity. If the relationships between nerds are not great, then everything's a pain in the ass. And of course, one of those things is just going to break the whole damn thing down and prevent it from fucking happening. Of course, of course, of course. So essence, relationships, process. Process is the most available for objects and outcomes. So that's why I'm starting with process mindfulness to rabbit hole the shit out of all these nerds to get into the vibe of indirect work, to get into the vibe of working down the causal stack, to get into alignment flow, a whole bunch of other hippie shit that we could talk about and describe. Anyway, my time's up. Love you guys. My name is Jeremy Akers, Jeremy Nathaniel Akers. This has been a Wide Scrubs production. This was Discovery Action Dialogue. I love you so much. Bye. Hey, what's up, sweetheart?